In the late 1920s, Charles Lindbergh represented the future. He was the embodiment of innovation, courage, and American exceptionalism. He would have an unprecedented rise and a later public fallout, but personally, he would experience every parent's worst nightmare: the kidnapping and murder of his young son, Charles Lindbergh Jr., who was only 20 months old at the time and arguably the most well known child in America. So, who would dare target the Lindbergh family? How could they expect to get away with it? Was it an elaborate professional job? Did they have help from the inside? Or was this something else entirely? This is true crime of the historical kind. You're listening to part one of the kidnapping and murder of Charles Lindbergh Jr., the Lone Eagle and the Eaglet. To understand the context behind such a tragic and horrific crime, we need to take a step back and look into what was happening in the United States following World War I. The Great War had consumed the world for 4 devastating years. America itself had been directly involved for about a year and a half, but to the American people, that was more than enough. Americans desperately wanted normalcy. President Warren G. Harding literally campaigned on a return to normalcy policy in the 1920 elections. Instead, the 20s seemed to see a reinvention of nearly every aspect of life. Economic prosperity was transforming much of the country, though the gap between the haves and the have-nots remained wide. City streets were filled with automobiles as jazz spilled out from dance halls and music crackled over radio airwaves. Motion pictures were transporting audiences into glamorous worlds of wealth, romance, and adventure. Meanwhile, organized crime flourished under Prohibition, and many Americans grew increasingly anxious about who they believed belonged in the country. Immigration laws became far more restrictive, reflecting a growing sense of nationalism. Newspapers chronicled it all: sensational crimes on one page and astonishing technological breakthroughs on the next. It was as if progress and corruption were advancing side by side. Perhaps the greatest symbol of progress was aviation. The Wright brothers first took flight in North Carolina in 1903. Barely 2 decades later, aviation had evolved into the cutting edge of human innovation. Yet it was still experimental and crashes were common. One of the greatest pioneers of this new frontier was Charles A. Lindbergh. Charles Augustus Lindbergh was born on February 4th in 1902 in Detroit, Michigan. His father was Charles August Lindbergh, a Swedish-born farmer, attorney, and congressman. His mother was Evangeline Lodge Land, who was a chemistry teacher that came from a highly educated family. Charles' parents separated when he was around 7, leaving him to grow up between very different worlds: a farm in rural Minnesota, the political atmosphere of Washington, D.C., and time in Detroit with his mother, where science and education were the strong priority. As a child, Charles seemed to be naturally fascinated with figuring out how things worked. On the family farm, he developed a hands-on understanding of engines and machinery and would eventually enroll in the mechanical engineering program at the University of Wisconsin. After 3 semesters, he left. Not because of any lack of drive or intelligence, but because, as we will see, Charles was the type of person that preferred doing things his own way. He learned by doing and getting his hands dirty. This made for a particular type of personality. Friends often described him as reserved, almost to the point of awkwardness. Yet he would pull pranks that most of the time only he found funny. This contrast of seriousness and childish jokes could come across as arrogant, self-centered, or out of touch. Some of these qualities may have come from his father, who was a man who had no problem standing apart from the crowd. Charles Lindbergh Sr. had built a career challenging some of the most powerful institutions in the country. As a progressive congressman from Minnesota, he attacked what he called the money trust, the Wall Street financiers led by J.P. Morgan and Co. He was also one of the few members of Congress to oppose arming American merchant ships in the lead up to World War I. So he published a book titled Why is Your Country at War and What Happens to You After the War and Related Subjects. The text argues that bankers and arms manufacturers had helped push the nation towards war for their own benefit. In a time where wartime nationalism was intensifying, the backlash was intense. Newspapers denounced Charles Lindbergh Sr. He was branded as a German sympathizer, and his political career never really recovered. Young Charles watched this happen firsthand. He learned how quickly the public opinion can turn on you. This made him weary of both the press and public life. So, as Charles entered the world of aviation that would eventually bring fame, it's important to note that fame was not the main motivation. His motivation was founded in the fascination with the mechanical, the scientific, and the experimental side of things, where problems were like puzzles that needed solving. He enjoyed thinking outside of the box to find solutions. In 1922, he enrolled at the Nebraska Aircraft Corporation in Lincoln, Nebraska. But he couldn't afford the damage bond that they required to let a student fly alone. So he spent the next year earning money by working as a wing walker and stunt parachutist for a traveling flying circus. Audiences on the ground watched him performing loops, dives, and aerial demonstrations while daredevils stood on the wings in mid flight. But to Lindbergh, flying was about much more than the stunts or the thrills. Every flight was a learning experience. In 1924, Lindbergh joined the U.S. Army Air Service as a cadet. He graduated first in his class, and within a few years, he was the chief pilot flying the airmail route between St. Louis and Chicago. He was steadily building a name for himself as a skilled and daring aviator. Still, no matter how much experience an aviator gained, the risks were still constant. Lindbergh had to bail out of a crashing aircraft several times, relying on a parachute to float him safely back to Earth. After each crash, he didn't hesitate getting right back up into the air. So, when a hotel owner named Raymond Ortigue came up with the Ortigue Prize, this was the perfect challenge for Charles. The prize was $25,000 for the first nonstop flight between New York and Paris, either direction. The Atlantic Ocean had been crossed by air before, but only in stages or over the shortest possible gap between Newfoundland and Ireland. This wasn't just an ordinary competition. This was life and death. 3 different teams of men had already attempted it. 4 men had died from crashes, and a team of 2 men had disappeared over the Atlantic. But that didn't deter Lindbergh. If anything, it fueled his ambition. He believed he could do it. With the help of a few sponsors, he worked to prepare an aircraft that could manage the long distance. Some of the main issues he was facing was to have enough gas to keep the plane in the air while also keeping the plane light. He stripped the plane of anything he deemed unnecessary, even a parachute, and a co-pilot. Lindbergh was going to do this alone. On May 20th, 1927, Charles Lindbergh departed from New York in an aircraft named the Spirit of St. Louis, navigating almost entirely by dead reckoning. Over the next 33 and a half hours, Lindbergh battled headwinds, rain, fog, and ice on the wings, while he was struggling to stay awake. Then, at last, he began to see sailing boats below him, signs that he was reaching the European continent. After navigating across France, Lindbergh spotted the Eiffel Tower, then headed toward the Le Bourget airfield. He didn't know it yet, but more than 100,000 people had gathered, some believing that he could do it while others didn't, and came to see him fail. Lindbergh initially circled the airfield, momentarily confused by the sea of lights below, before he ended up touching down at 10:22 p.m. local time. The people of Paris erupted in cheers. Moments later, they cheered even louder as Lindbergh climbed from the cockpit and waved. Needless to say, Lindbergh had won the Ortigue Prize. The achievement meant far more than the $25,000 reward purse. Lindbergh was an immediate sensation. Upon Lindbergh's return to the United States, he was received with overwhelming excitement. This is what is called the Lindbergh boom. There was a massive parade, and President Calvin Coolidge presented him with the first ever Distinguished Flying Cross. The next year, he'd receive the Medal of Honor. He was promoted to colonel in the Army Air Corps Reserve, and he became Time magazine's very first Man of the Year. There was even talk of him running for president. Lindbergh received millions of letters and thousands of telegrams from people all around the world. His face was everywhere. His image was used to sell cigarettes, food, watches, shaving products, you name it, and usually without his permission. Movie studios were offering him contracts that were worth millions. After all, he was considered a very good-looking man. In the eyes of the public, he became the world's most eligible bachelor. But his views on marriage reflected that same practical mindset that he brought into flying. He admired intelligence, discipline, physical health, and capability, qualities he believed should be preserved and passed into the next generation. Growing up on a farm in Minnesota, he had seen livestock selectively bred for desirable traits. To Lindbergh, it wasn't an unreasonable comparison. He saw human heredity in much of the same light, which was a pretty common mindset for the time. For Lindbergh, the fame had come almost overnight, and now he was finding himself moving among America's wealthiest families: the Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts, and the Guggenheims. Families who had built fortunes through industry and innovation. In the United States, the self made man had become a source of national pride. Few embodied that ideal more than Charles Lindbergh. Financiers, industrialists, and diplomats and politicians all wanted to meet the man who had conquered the Atlantic, which is how he came to meet the Morrow family. The family patriarch, Dwight Morrow, had made his fortune as a partner at J.P. Morgan and Co., ironically the very firm Lindbergh's own father had spent years campaigning against. Dwight was married to Elizabeth Morrow, a poet and outspoken advocate for women's education. Together, they had 4 children, including 2 daughters, Elizabeth and Anne. Elizabeth was the elder of the 2. She was bright, idealistic, and devoted to her studies. She and Anne were close, though Elizabeth's fragile health would become a quiet and constant worry for the whole family. Anne was a shy 21-year-old senior at Smith's College. She was intelligent, observant, and adventurous. She kept journals constantly. She loved literature and was fascinated by flying, which meant she was very excited when she found out that she could be meeting the Charles Lindbergh. Mr. Morrow had recently been appointed as the U.S. ambassador to Mexico and invited Lindbergh to Mexico City as part of a goodwill tour meant to smooth relations between the 2 countries. While there, Charles and Anne met for the first time in the U.S. Embassy. When the 2 struck up a conversation, they connected over a shared passion for aviation. Anne expressed how she wanted to learn to fly, and, well, who better to teach her to fly than the lone eagle, as they called him. From there, their courtship quickly developed. Socially, the connection between the famous aviator and a wealthy heiress made sense, though the Morrows did find him to be somewhat of an odd man. They were surprised to find that he was quiet but particular. He was even somewhat rigid, doing things his way, and maybe saying somewhat is being nice. But he carried himself with a kind of seriousness and discipline that set him apart from the more sociable world that the Morrows were used to. Anne, however, was fascinated by him. Before long, they had fallen in love. The newspapers couldn't get enough of them. Press attention was relentless. For nearly 2 years, reporters had tracked Lindbergh's every movement, and his romantic life gave them more stories to sell. Anne, being a rich American heiress, only made the press attention more intense. And that intensity was not appreciated by Charles. On May 27th of 1929, Charles and Anne invited a small group of friends and family to the Morrow estate in Englewood, New Jersey. Only after everyone arrived did they learn that they were about to attend Charles and Anne's wedding. The secrecy was a deliberate plan to trick the press. It was an early glimpse of what their marriage would become. Even their most private moments could be transformed into public spectacle. Anne would later describe those early years of fame as a kind of captivity. To the public, a lot of the photographs looked glamorous. To Anne and Charles, it meant strangers shouting their names, photographers appearing without warning, and the constant feeling of being watched. The weight of it all was beginning to take its toll. Not long after their wedding, the couple began building a home in the rolling countryside of Hopewell, New Jersey. It would be an estate called Highfields. The home itself was tucked into hundreds of acres of dense oak and hickory woods on the Sourland mountain ridge. It was rocky, brushy country that even the locals considered wild, but it was still close enough to family and the city. There was a long, winding drive that made it impossible to see the house from the road. It felt isolated, which was exactly the point. While the estate was being carefully constructed, the Lindberghs stayed in Inglewood with Anne's family, where there was already established security in place. The Lindberghs' early marriage was filled with constant working and traveling as flying partners, though Anne wasn't just a part of Charles' crew. She was a pilot in her own right. She would end up becoming the first American woman to earn a first class glider's pilot's license. Together, they worked for Pan American Airways, surveying potential routes. These mapping excursions could be long and grueling. Soon, Anne found out that she was pregnant. There was little to no understanding of how flying might affect a pregnancy. She was scrutinized in the press for continuing to fly. Gradually, her shift towards motherhood did mean less time in the air. Then, on Anne's 24th birthday, June 22nd, 1930, Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr. was born. Charles and Anne were overjoyed. Their son quickly became the center of their world, especially for Anne. When the birth of the Lindbergh baby was announced, it was as if the whole nation was gaining a child. Newspapers reported on the birth with a level of fascination usually reserved for royalty. And in many ways, the Lindberghs had become America's closest thing to a royal family. The press nicknamed the baby the Eaglet, but Anne and Charles simply called him Charlie. Much of the attention was well meaning. Americans genuinely celebrated the young family, but notoriety comes at a cost. With an infant, the level of exposure felt vulnerable, more so than when it was just them. People recall Charles even making the comment or comments that he was worried that his son would be kidnapped. And at the time, that wasn't an unfounded fear. As the country slipped deeper into the Great Depression, ransom kidnappings were on the rise. Organized criminal networks had flourished during Prohibition, and wealthy, high profile families were viewed as lucrative targets. Just a few years earlier, Marion Parker had been abducted and held for ransom. She was the young daughter of a prominent Los Angeles banker, Perry Parker. In December of 1927, Marion was taken from her school by a man named William Edward Hickman. He had simply walked into the school and told them that Marion's father had been in a car accident and needed his daughter. Hickman demanded $1,500 from her father, and Perry paid. Perry thought that he would be receiving his daughter back, but tragically, she had already been killed. It was a gruesome scene. Her eyes were wired open to look alive, and her arms and legs had been removed. Then there was the 1924 Leopold and Loeb case in Chicago. Two wealthy university students kidnapped and murdered 14-year-old Bobby Franks, the son of a family in their own neighborhood. They had mailed the parents a ransom letter, knowing that the boy was already dead. Both cases were widely followed, and wealthy families feared that one of their own could be taken in an attempt to extort money from them. And the chances of them being returned alive was unlikely. Threats were regularly sent to well known figures, but it was impossible to know which, if any, should be taken seriously. So, kidnapping remained a present but hypothetical fear. The Lindberghs had more immediate concerns at the time. Anne's older sister, Elizabeth, was seriously ill with a heart condition, and her declining health weighed heavily on the entire Morrow family. Lindbergh had long been fascinated by biology and the mechanics of the human body, but Elizabeth's illness may have given that interest a new sense of purpose. He was frustrated by the limitations of modern surgery, particularly the inability to safely operate on the human heart. and he began wondering whether its function could be sustained mechanically. That curiosity led him to a collaboration with French surgeon and Nobel Prize winner Alexis Carrel. Carrel was renowned for his pioneering work in vascular surgery and organ preservation, researching how living tissue might be kept alive outside of the body. Together, the two developed a mechanical perfusion pump, an apparatus that was designed to circulate fluid through organs, keeping them alive independently of the body. In many ways, this venture reflected that same mindset Lindbergh had brought to aviation, understanding complex systems and believing science could overcome what once seemed impossible. But Carrel was more than a pioneering surgeon. He was also one of the leading advocates of eugenics, a movement that argued society could be improved through selective reproduction, to put it lightly. During the 1920s and 30s, these ideas were embraced by many scientists, physicians, universities, and political leaders on both sides of the Atlantic. In the United States, more than 30 states had enacted compulsory sterilization laws. Lindbergh's admiration for Carrel's scientific work would eventually lead to consequences for his own reputation, but those controversies still lay in the future. In real time, the Morrows were struck with more heartache. In October of 1931, while Anne and Charles were away on a surveying trip, word reached them that Anne's father, Dwight Morrow, had died of a stroke. They rushed back to Inglewood to be with family as they mourned. The overwhelming grief only added to the family's need to retreat from the public. Anne wanted to stay close to her mother while also being anxious to bring Charlie to a home of their own, yet Highfield was still unfinished. So until the house was complete, the Lindberghs settled into a routine. They spent weekdays at the Morrow estate in Inglewood, where there was a staff of nearly 30 keeping the household running. Weekends were spent at Highfield with the permanent staff that was much smaller. There was the English butler and caretaker, Ollie Whately, and his wife Elsie, who managed the household. Though some staff from Inglewood would come to Highfield when needed, like Betty Gow. Betty was Charlie's nurse, a young Scottish woman who adored him. Charlie was growing into a healthy, energetic boy. He had blonde hair and bright blue eyes. Anne loved doting on him. It was difficult for her to leave him behind when Charles wanted her to accompany him on flights, though she trusted Betty Gow and her own mother to care for him. Charles was away most of the time, but he remained firmly in charge of how he believed the household should be run and how his son should be raised. Friends and family described him as a disciplined father who valued independence and self-reliance, believing children should learn those qualities from an early age. Lindbergh believed children should not be indulged and favored discipline over comfort. Anne, by contrast, was naturally more affectionate, and the two occasionally disagreed on where that balance should lie. Yet, as was common at the time, Charles expected to have the final say in matters of the household. So, while Charles did have a strict approach, he could be playful as well, like throwing Charlie high in the air before catching him at the very last moment, making Charlie laugh and squeal. And he still had his taste in practical jokes. On at least one occasion, he hid Charlie inside of a closet, allowing the household to search in growing panic for nearly half of an hour before revealing the little boy's hiding place. Anne didn't find this particularly funny, but to Charles, it was just harmless fun. By all accounts, Charlie seemed like a happy, healthy child. He was curious about everything around him, he was learning to walk, began talking, and loved playing with the family's wire-haired fox terrier, Wagoosh. Yet Anne began noticing a few small concerns. Charlie's physician observed that his head appeared slightly enlarged and noticed bowed legs and crossed toes, features that raised concerns he might have rickets. Rickets was a fairly common childhood illness at the time. It was caused by a deficiency in vitamin D. Children affected could have symptoms that varied greatly. In mild cases, it could be corrected, while more severe cases sometimes resulted in permanent skeletal deformities. Charlie was placed on vitamin D supplements, but no definitive diagnosis was ever made. This wasn't known by the public. Newspapers eagerly followed each new milestone of his young life. That attention only deepened Charles' concerns about his son's privacy. He even instructed Anne and her mother not to photograph Charlie and tried to limit when and how the little boy was seen, even in informal settings. Anne and her mother couldn't help themselves but take some pictures here and there. Overall, there were relatively few photographs of Charlie. Anne gradually found herself trying to balance motherhood and the adventurous life she and Charles had built together. Flying remained one of the great joys that they shared. Yet, according to her journals, each departure became a little more difficult. She hated leaving Charlie behind. And that tension only deepened when she learned that she was expecting their second child. This put even more emphasis on settling at Highfields, where they were still only spending weekends. Except in late February of 1932. The weather in Hopewell turned cold, wet, and dreary. Charlie, who was now 20 months old, developed a cold and was feeling unwell. Rather than make the little boy travel back to Inglewood, Anne decided to remain at Highfields for a few extra days. She telephoned Betty Gow at the Morrow estate and asked her to come help with Charlie. So Betty was driven to Hopewell that same day. On the evening of Tuesday, March 1st, Betty gave Charlie a bath, rubbed his chest with Vicks for his cold, and wanted to keep him extra warm. So she cut and stitched a little flannel shirt for him, slipping it on over his sleeping suit before laying him in his crib around 8 p.m. Before heading downstairs, Betty closed the shutters in the nursery windows, except one seemed to be warped and wouldn't latch. Lindbergh had been expected at a speaking engagement that evening, but for reasons that remained somewhat unclear, he returned to Highfields instead, getting in around 8:25 p.m. He and Anne ate a late dinner, then settled into the living room, which sat directly below the nursery. And sometime after 9, Charles heard something, like a sharp crack, like the slats of an orange crate breaking apart. But the adults in the house were still up and moving around, and he thought nothing of it. At around 10 p.m., Betty went to go check on Charlie. She opened the door to the nursery and did a double take. The crib was empty. She looked around, assuming he must have climbed out or maybe someone else had picked him up. She was concerned but felt there must be an explanation. So she hurried down the stairs and directed her attention to Mr. Lindbergh, convinced or perhaps hoping that he had hidden the baby as a prank again. Her exact words were, "Colonel, do you have the baby? Please don't fool me." Anne believed it must have been a joke as well. She turned to her husband, looking into his face for confirmation. But when she saw his expression, her smile faded. She knew instantly this was not a joke. They raced upstairs to confirm the terrifying reality. Charlie was not there. For a few seconds, no one seemed to be willing to believe what they were seeing. After all, the room looked completely normal. There was no sign of disturbance. Surely they had overlooked something. As much as their minds were trying to figure out a way to explain this reality, there was only one explanation. Charles said, "Anne, they have stolen our baby." This was true crime of the historical kind. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you for your patience. I haven't been able to get out as many episodes as I have wanted to this summer. I mean, I always have more episodes that I want to do, but the more that you guys are supporting the show, the more time it allows me to dedicate to it. So for everyone that's following, sharing, liking, or commenting, thank you so much. I really, really appreciate it. You guys are amazing. Until next time, bye.